counsel, assistant state attorneys, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and our witness, Brandon Collins, remains on the stand. Ladies and gentlemen, I just had a nice lunch. When we broke, counsel had not yet had an opportunity to commence her cross-examination of this witness, so we're going to turn it over to the defense now. Counsel, if you're ready, you may proceed.
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, Agent Collins.
Good afternoon, Ms. Liberty.
Nice to see you in person. The last time we met, I think it was over Zoom.
Yes.
So, and last time we met, you actually told us you were working for the terrorism squad section of the FBI.
The transnational organized crime.
Okay, and that's where you learned the CAS report stuff as a collateral duty, correct?
No, I started doing CAS as collateral duty when I was a special agent working gangs, part of our State Street's gang unit. And then I started doing terrorism investigations as my primary job and continued doing CAS as a collateral duty. Then I did CAS full-time in DC as a supervisor. Then I got promoted to field supervisor, which is my current job. I do that exclusively.
So you're still supervising organized crime?
Yes.
So do you do any of the CAS work with the organized crime?
No.
So, do you know, if you know, when's the last time you actually did a CAS report? An actual one for an actual case, when's the last time?
This would be, so I kept all the cases that I had done previously that had been adjudicated.
Okay.
I have not taken new cases since becoming a supervisor.
And just curious, from the last time we spoke, which was about a year ago to now, has anything changed with the technology that we should be aware of?
No.
Right. So, you had testified earlier talking about timing exams, and you said with T-Mobile they call that true data, correct?
Timing advance is the principle where the network is able to calculate the distance from a tower. T-Mobile has a brand called TrueCall that they use to do that.
And who within T-Mobile would do the true call? Is that engineers? Who would know that information?
I don't know.
So I'm going to put up your report. I'm looking at this band.
Hold on a second. You want that?
Oh, I do. Sorry.
Thank you, Gary.
All right, so this is your report, and we have this band here that kind of looks like, I know last time you called a hot dog, I like to call it like macaroni, but what does this band represent?
That is the timing advance band. So the engineering report, the TrueCall report from T-Mobile would say the distance from the tower is 0.24 miles. And so then based on the timing advance measurement, which in 4G is 78 meters, that band is 78 meters deep, so it would be plus or minus 39 from 2.4 miles on either side.
So plus or minus, so it's an estimated distance, correct?
Yes.
All right. How does T-Mobile determine, I think you testified earlier that T-Mobile determines the distance by speed times time equals distance, correct?
Yes.
All right. And how fast does that signal travel?
At the speed of light.
All right. And you had testified earlier that the speed of light is a static number, correct?
Yes.
However, I tried to do the math myself because I think I'm really smart. And one of the things that I came across when I was looking at the speed of light was that it could actually be a 3 times 10 to the 8th power meters per second, or the actual number is 2.99792458 times 10 to the 8th power. So if you know, is T-Mobile using the higher number of the 3 or using the actual number with the speed of light?
I don't know.
Okay, but you would agree when we're dealing with the meters per second, that could actually speed a big distance, correct?
Yeah, so obviously the bigger the distance or the bigger the time, then the more significant the difference between those two numbers would be, yes.
And just curious, would that estimate, because we talk a lot about sectors and I'll get further into it, is it possible that that estimate would change what sector you're paying off of?
It's possible estimate change the sector depending on.
Well, let me ask you this,
No.
because if we're dealing with a meter, if we're dealing with a meter, it's 3 feet 3 inches, correct?
Yeah.
And if I'm off by 4 or 5 meters, we're talking about like 15 feet basically, correct? A little bit more than 15 feet.
Yeah, so I guess at some point there always has to be a transition from one sector to the other, because they have multiple sectors. So on the sector boundary, could that change? I guess, yeah, there's a possibility for that for sure.
Okay. Can you do this calculation yourself?
Which calculator?
The calculation of the speed times time equals distance. Can you do that math yourself
Yes, I can.
by hand? And would you include timestamps when you did that calculation?
So I didn't do that calculation for this report. I used the distance that was in the engineering records that T-Mobile gave it produced. If they gave me the time, and we could use either 3.0 or 2.99, whatever the other number that you said was for the speed of light. I can do math if that was your question, but for this report I did not do that math to produce these distances.
Okay. So can you tell me about any publication that would tell us about these expected accuracy of the timing advance records?
Nope.
All right. You haven't. So in your map, throughout your map, you talk about these bands and the distance from the tower. Is there any publications or any other data that you have that would explain how accurate that is?
No.
Do you know of any scientific testing outside of the legal community as to this whole cell tower stuff?
I mean, the cellular community, because this is an important part of how cell phones work on a cellular network.
Okay.
But apart from that, no.
Okay. And you show that band as a plus or minus 10 miles, correct? Is that the width of it?
No, it's 78 meters.
All right. And could you break that down? How big would that be? If you were to compare, like, would that be a football field, 2 football fields?
No, it's less than a football field, slightly less than a football field.
So slightly less, like 3/4 of a football field?
Something like that.
And do you have any factual basis that would back that up?
Factual basis for what 78 meters is?
Yeah. No, well, the distance, the approximation of the span. Do you have anything that would back that up?
As to why it's 78 meters?
Yeah.
Because that's what based on how the technology works, based on 4G, that's what the time advance is. I mean, that's just what it is.
So did T-Mobile tell you this in your training, or how did you figure it out?
Yeah, through my training experience, not T-Mobile specifically, but I mean, that's regardless of whether it's T-Mobile or Verizon, Sprint, I mean, 4G technology, the time in advance is 78 meters.
All right, so is this an estimate that's being made by T-Mobile?
The distance?
Yeah.
The tower?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So would you say that this is T-Mobile's best estimate and it's actually no more accurate than the call detail records themselves?
Well, so I think that in my opinion and experience, generally the time in advance is accurate. The call detail records are accurate. I guess I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
So I was just asking, it's T-Mobile's best estimate on this map, correct? Is it any different or any more or less accurate than the call data records, the CDR?
Well, the call detail records will have to be more accurate because they are less precise. So without a doubt, that is the sector that the phone chose. The timing advance measurement, in my experience, is accurate, but there are factors that could make it less accurate than the call detail records. For instance, we just talked about how the difference of whatever 3 100ths in math could make a difference in the calculation of distance. Earlier, we talked about how like multipath signal bounces off multiple surfaces on the way to the phone or on the way from the phone back to the tower. That would increase the amount of time that it traveled, which would then also increase the distance. So although I think the timing advance is accurate, because it's more precise, there's the potential for it to be less accurate than call detail records.
So do you know of any publications or studies that would back up your opinion?
No.
Okay, so based on that information, you can't really tell the court precisely which locations these phones are following, can you?
No, and one of the limitations of cellular analysis is that you can only say a general area where the device would be at a given time.
All right, so even with the general analysis, all of the stuff that we've gone through for about 4 or 5 hours, at the end of the day, you can never give an exact location.
True.
All right. Can you tell us if a phone is on a highway?
So that depends. For one data point, no, you can't. You just general area where the phone would be. If you have multiple data points, you may be able to infer an opinion as to where you think it is. For instance, like in this case, if you see the device traveling from east to west, in towers along 595, and you look at the time between those towers, you could infer what the speed would be, and say, okay, I think it's likely that they're on the highway because I know the area, or they're on State Road 84 traveling at a certain speed. But from the cellular data alone, no, you can't tell if the phone's in a car, on the side of the road, on the road.
So can you tell if it's in the woods?
No,
How about another residence located in the area?
no,
And could you tell if somebody was walking around a car with the phone? Would you be able to tell that?
no.
Okay. Go back to your report. So it'd be your testimony that this phone, 9807, could be from here to here, correct?
Yes.
And what was the distance from here to here?
Oh, I don't know what the distance is from one end of that illustrated arc to the other.
Okay. Well, can you actually guarantee that the phone is in that arc?
No.
And why can't you guarantee that it's in this arc?
So that arc depicts the timing advance measurement with the accounting for including the 78 years timing advance, which is all the resolution you can get. Why I can't guarantee that it's there as well. One, the sectors themselves, the sector itself. So that's an illustration, it's an approximation of the sector, right? Like talked earlier about it being a flashlight to illustrate the direction that the cell signal is going. If anyone drew a flashlight, we draw a cone or something that looks like this. But everyone who's used a flashlight knows that it's not actually like a tube on a paper towel. It's not actually just the tube, right? It's brightest here and it gets weaker and weaker and weaker. So although in this illustration there's hard black arms that say this is the limit of the sector, that's not really the case. There's some bleed over it. So that's the first point, is that it could be, in this instance, potentially over here, potentially over here. Second instance is, as we talked about, if there was something that delayed the signal traveling from the tower to the phone or back, that would make the distance longer than where the phone actually is. So it's a depiction of the records, but with 100% accuracy to say that the phone has to be in this band. No, I can't say that 100%.
Okay. And I did switch the page, so we're looking at your page 12 of your report. And looking at this, can you tell the court if the phone is between these two bands at any given time?
Well, I infer, in my opinion, yes, because it had to have been at some point in time between those two bands, because it was here at 350 or somewhere within this area at 352, 58, and somewhere here at 353, 48. So to get from here to here, we had to be somewhere between them at some point.
But didn't you tell us earlier that you don't always necessarily connect to the tower closest to you as the one with the best signal? So could it be possible that this is actually the tower with the best signal and the phone is nowhere in that sector?
So this is from the engineering report, and so the engineering report had two measurements for this tower and sector, the 0.58 miles and the 1.16 miles. The engineering report does not, that's the network's perspective. So when I was talking about what they call detail records, where the phone measures the clearest, strongest signal, and then picks the tower or the antenna on the tower that offers the clearest, strongest signal, that's from the call detail records. The engineering reports is the network's perspective.
So where did you get the engineering reports from?
From T-Mobile.
So didn't you previously testify that Detective Moretti gave you these records?
Yes.
So did they come from Moretti or from T-Mobile?
From Detective Moretti.
All right.
From T-Mobile.
And so the engineering report, is it what Ms. Bradley, the state attorney, had put up previously, all these numbers and environments? Is that-
Yes.
Okay. Do you double check that report?
What do you mean?
Do you validate it? So you get this report with all these numbers. Do you have a system in place at the FBI that you could cross-reference this to make sure that the latitude and longitude and the distance is actually what it's saying it is?
No.
So, do you even know if it's credible?
Yeah,
Objection
my
outside the scope.
Overruled. You can answer the question.
So, yeah, the accuracy of this report is like pinned on those records being accurate. In my experience, the records that we get from telecommunications providers are accurate, which is why this works.
Well, let me ask you. So, have you ever had an engineer come through on any of your cases, the 130 cases that you had, and had them validate the information that you got from T-Mobile, Sprint, or whatever carrier it is?
So, I've had cases where there was actually, no, not for me. I know of other cast assets who had cases where there was a red flag or a problem, and then we contacted the engineers and said, hey, there's something with that that's not making sense. We need to look more into this. But for me, no.
All right. Do you know of any instances in these records where a mistake or any oddity occurred?
No.
All right. So, and you already testified you did not request an engineer to assist you to review these records, correct?
Correct.
And you said that one of these bands would be a little less than 100 yards wide?
Yes.
All right. I want to show you this engineering report that you're talking about. Okay. So there's a section on this engineering report that's labeled environment. All right, and it goes on to tell you, and I'm looking for, good thing I didn't do the cell tower analysis, it'd be a mess, so obviously I can't handle this modern technology. But you have a section in here called environment. I just want to find where it's at.
I think is it to the left?
You know, it's so small I can't even see it. But you know what I'm talking about when I talk about environment, correct?
Yes.
Do you rely on this?
No.
Why?
I don't know how it's calculated.
So, and it goes back to my other questioning. This document that's produced from T-Mobile, from their engineer, your engineering report, says that T-Mobile can tell you if a phone is outside, inside. So why do you rely on everything else in this document, but you won't rely on that column?
So I rely on the time in advance, I guess, just because I have, well, I think it's really comes down to two things. One, because I understand it, I understand speed of light times time equals the distance. And two, because I've done that and I've been able to validate that through my real world experience. That's why I have confidence in time in advance. When it comes to the environment and the latitude and longitude coordinates and their associated confidence level, why don't I use that? Well, I didn't use them in this report because I don't know all the factors that go into calculating those. And I don't have real world experience validating those or disproving them to speak to myself personally, whether they would be as accurate.
You had previously testified that in your training you actually get invited out to different cellular companies, correct?
Yeah.
And did you get invited to T-Mobile?
Never been to T-Mobile.
Okay. Do you know if any of your cast people went to T-Mobile?
I don't know.
Okay. Can you tell us how T-Mobile can tell if the phone is indoors?
I don't know.
Have you ever performed any testing to determine if a phone is indoors or outdoors based on the time in advance records from T-Mobile?
No.
And is there any way for you to verify that environment column? The environment estimate from T-Mobile?
Yeah, I mean, if we wanted to test it, we could coordinate something with T-Mobile, or I'm sure T-Mobile could test it, where they would use test phones and do things that people do with phones, calls, texts, data. They would look at the phones on their record and say, like, okay, here's our control group, and here's what the data said, and here's where the phones actually were. So, is there a way to do it? I'm sure that.
We were kind of just talking about a hypothetical, because
Right.
as far as you know, it's never happened.
Right.
Okay. So, with the true call distance estimates, has T-Mobile ever shared the calculation with you or possibly other members of the casting?
The calculation is the speed 3.0 or 2.997, whatever times the time. That's the calculation.
So have they shared that with you guys? Have you gone through to find out what exact number is, how they're coming up with these formulas, anything like that?
Yeah, and that's that calculation for time in advance. Again, that's not unique to T-Mobile. That's how all phones have to function on cellular networks. They have to have time in advance measurements. So that's something we'll talk about multiple providers and
So this is,
cellular networks.
T-Mobile gives it to you. You have 100% trust in T-Mobile and its records. So you just get them and you go off of that, correct?
I plot the data from T-Mobile and do an analysis. I don't take anything for given as I'm doing my analysis.
But you don't know if the numbers are correct because you don't have an engineer validating or rechecking anything, do you? So you're,
I'm relying on the accuracy of the records, yes.
all right. So basically you're telling us that we're to trust an undisclosed calculation as being accurate.
Objection, argument.
Stayed.
Right. And do you not have any of the measurements for the underlying true call data?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of columns on this engineering report. It's possible that something is buried there, but I don't think so.
Go back to your report. So in this report, you say that the measurements of,
Zoom out. Just like on the phone.
I'll move it up here. So your report says, you can come over the stage if you want to help me.
Of course.
That these two phones, 9807 and 9081, are in the area of the crime scene, correct?
Does it say consistent with, or what's the,
Your language is cellular measurements are consistent with, yes, the two phones being in the area of the crime scene.
yes,
All right, but is it not true that they could also be over here?
yes,
And could 9807 be over here and 9081 be over here?
yes.
Could it be over here?
I don't think so, yes, yes,
And right here?
yes,
And again, this is an estimate because it could just be pinging to the tower with the best signal, correct?
no, because this is from the engineering report.
Okay. So, page 14 of your report, you say that phone number 9807 is within this area, correct?
Yes,
But would you agree it's not actually touching any of the points of interest?
at that time,
Yes.
yes. If you find points of interest, if you mean the locations that were highlighted earlier in the presentation, then yes, it's not overlapping the Montessori Academy or any other place at that time.
Okay, let's turn to page 16 of your report. So does this show phone number ending in 9081 near the hospital?
Yes, that's consistent with the phone being at the hospital.
But this science is not actually precise enough to pinpoint the location of the phone, correct?
Correct.
So while you say it's consistent with it being at the hospital, you actually don't know that, do you?
From the cellular data alone, no.
Right. Let's go to 17. Here you've mapped again the data for 9807. And again, would you agree that this macaroni does not touch any of the points of interest?
Yes,
Can you explain what this means? Can you see that?
340, the text box that you're pointing
Yeah,
to?
yes.
Yes, so that means that there were multiple data points on that tower and sector between 3:43 a.m. and 3:52 a.m.
Okay, so 3:43 to 3:52 a.m., that phone number was pinging off of this tower.
So it's from the engineering reports, and that tower saw the phone multiple times between 3:43 and 3:52.
Okay, so let's go over here, and what's this mean?
The same thing, all these cell sites that are shown are from the protocol measurement data from Sprint's engineering reports, and those towers in that sector on that tower saw the phone at whatever time is indicated.
Do you know the difference from this point to this point?
I'd imagine it's a couple miles.
So, from this report, we're showing that there's a couple miles difference, but the phone is pinging over here at 3:49 but according to your report, between 343 and 352, it's pinging here.
Mhm.
And what does this one mean right here?
348.
So it's pinging from this tower at 348.
That tower saw the phone, yes.
All right. And then down here,
350.
so again, back here, between 343 to 352, it was pinging off of this tower. But at 350, it was down here.
No. The phone wasn't down there, it wasn't up here, the phone wasn't in any of those places. That's not what the data says. The data is saying is that these towers at those times saw the phone. This is all from the engineering reports, which means that the towers, these towers that see them, are not necessarily the tower with the clearest, strongest signal. It's not necessarily the serving cell that saw it. If we had distance information at these times, we'd see like a band, just like we did on the T-Mobile record. So for instance, at this one, 349, we'd see a distance, whether it was an arc like this or like this, whatever. The distance column on that engineering report for all these data points was blank. We don't have distance. So we know that these towers saw the phone. And we know that they were not necessarily the serving cell. It could have been. Any one of them could have been, but we don't know that. And we don't have any calls on the call detail records to, to cross-check and say, okay, well, which tower did the phone reach out to and it needed any call? So we're left to the question then is, well, what's this mean? Because as you we're just asking, as we were just talking about, 349 falls between 343 and 352. How could two towers in two completely different areas both see the phone? Well, they both did see the phone at different times because they registered that connection with the phone. So if you ask me what's my opinion, what's that mean? It's like, well, the phone was someplace where all these towers could see it. And I note that this one is pointed generally west, this one's pointed west-southwest, this one's pointed southeast, this is northeast, this is this way. So my conclusion would be that this data, which it's hard to form a conclusion from because I don't have the distance information I want. It's not to say, okay, the phone is, generally it's in Miramar. We know that, right? It's not in Fort Lauderdale or Miami. It's probably somewhere in the middle of all these towers. So if I'm asked a specific question, like, hey, is this consistent with the phone being in Silver Lakes? I would say yes. Is it consistent with the phone being in McDonald's? Yes. I mean, this is a...
So it could be anywhere in Miramar, basically.
I don't think it could be anywhere in Miramar. I think it could be anywhere kind of in this map area. I think it's a fair statement.
Okay. At any given time as well, correct? Because I just for the sake of my knowledge,
Yeah.
when we look at this item that says 343 to 352, so
Yeah.
I know it's hitting that tower throughout that time, right? But it's then also hitting this other tower at the exact same time, and 30 seconds it's hitting this other tower. Is that a fair statement?
The network's hitting the phone. The
Okay.
phone isn't hitting the network, but yes.
Okay, and then how far can a phone go? Is it 1 mile? Could it be between 1 mile and 20 miles? Or could a phone ping off a tower that's 50 miles away? Do you have any background on that?
Yeah, so it depends kind of what you're asking. If you're asking how far away can a phone be from a tower when it makes a call, well, that depends. If you're asking how far away can a tower see a phone, which is a different thing, because the phone choosing the tower is going to rely off the phone's clear, strongest signal, and that also depends. Generally, I see something in the range of like a couple miles, but I've seen in extreme cases many miles that a tower can see a phone.
Okay. So even with this is, again, based on that,
Yep.
any area
Yeah,
could be in
not
and just ping.
To try and make a conclusion about a precise location for a phone on this data is, I don't think possible, based on this data alone.
So wouldn't it be more accurate just to show a range of where it could be at rather than trying to do these curves and pinpoint the precision?
What do you mean?
I mean, you would agree with me that there are some unknowns. Even though we're talking about the speed of light static, we don't know what T-Mobile's using. Are they rounding up to the 3, or are they actually keeping the right number, correct?
Well, regardless of what they're doing, they're giving us a distance, and that's the distance that's plotted. So we plot the distance, applying the records that T-Mobile gave us, not saying, okay, the phone's, you know, here in this bubble or something like that. We're saying, hey, this is what the records show.
Well, it seems like you're giving testimony that it's precise, but when we get through the data, how it's used, that it's actually really just an estimate. So is it precise, or is this an estimate that you're giving us?
It's when, I guess it's not an estimate like a, hey, just some number that's made up, just a ballpark, hey, out of 10,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
But if you're asking, I think you're asking about really the accuracy, not the precision, because that number, like if it's the number is 0.54 miles, that's a precise number, right? That's down to the hundredths of a mile. You're asking how accurate is that number? And we'll say, okay, generally that's accurate. And that's why with my testimony, even when I have a precise number like 0.54 miles from a tower, I still say, hey, it's consistent with it being in this location, where it's generally in the area of this apartment complex or something, because the possibility it may not be precisely there.
So based on that map, could it be possible that you had 2 phones registered to the same person on the same carrier being operated by 2 different people who were sitting next to each other? Can those 2 phones ping off different towers?
When you say paying off towers, you mean are you talking about the engineering report?
Yeah, the engineering report.
Could different towers see those phones?
Yeah, so
Yes.
we're both sitting in the car here.
Yep.
Is it possible that it's pinging off to here and then the other person's phone is pinging here?
Yes.
Well, they're next to each other.
Yes.
All right. Can you tell if this phone's in somebody's pocket?
No.
Can you tell if it's left on the car seat?
No.
Can you tell if we've had the phone?
No.
Okay. No further questions?
Counsel, thank you.
Thank you, Judge.
You ready to redirect?
Yes, Your Honor.
You ready, you may proceed.
So in terms of, I want to make sure we're clear and it's very clear for the jury. What's the difference between the engineering report and the call detail report?
So the call detail records show what the phone was doing, like the phone's calls and texts. And they will list a tower and a sector in them. And that's the tower and the sector that the phone identified as the one that offers the clearest, strongest signals. That's the tower that the phone chose to connect to when it needed to make a call or send a text. That's the phone's perspective. The engineering report is the network's perspective. So different towers that may or may not be the serving cell could have seen the phone.
Why is it important to differentiate between those two?
Because, so if I'm plotting doing a report and I plot the phone that was the serving, or the tower that was the serving cell, then I'm showing, okay, wherever the phone was in this coverage area, it's on this is the one, the best tower, the best, the strongest signal point. With the engineering report, like the slide we were just looking at, none of those may have been the best one. So if I'm looking at something that I plotted because of call detail records, I would infer that that's probably the tower that's the closest or is the best line of sight. With the engineering data, that may not be the case.
Okay, and so in the one we were just talking about, that was under the 3717895. That phone, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So if you can explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there was discussion about the accuracy versus the precision of the records. Is this a precise estimate of which towers saw that phone?
Yes.
And how can you say that?
Because it listed, the records listed specific towers that saw the phone at a specific time.
Are you ever going to say, based on the data that you have here, precisely where that phone was?
No.
What conclusions can you draw from this map based on your training and experience?
That the phone is generally somewhere in the area shown on the map. In my opinion, it's likely to be in the center of the map here, because that's where the direction that the antennas and towers that saw the phone are pointing.
So council asked you about the latitude and longitude columns that are on the call records from the engineering report.
Yes,
And so you mentioned that you do not validate these particular records.
yes,
Could they be accurate?
they certainly could be accurate, yes.
Can you explain as to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if you call 911, what does a cell phone provider send out to law enforcement?
At a minimum, it has to provide the tower and center phone.
Oh. And at maximum, what can they provide?
I don't know.
In terms of those coordinates and things of that, is that also collected for the purposes of location for 911 emergency?
It may be.
Okay. You had said that, and council asked you a lot about validating your findings, your records, your analysis. When you are doing the training and experience, do you validate the records that are given to you by going out and finding a specific phone in the field?
Yes,
Okay. Would you be able to validate your records with other corroborating information?
yes,
For example, a video, would that help validate your records if the phone is seen in the video?
yes,
If there is video or surveillance footage of locations and the phone is seen in that area, would that validate your information?
yes,
Is, for example, on the cell phone records that have been placed in the mapping of the 772-713-9807 and going to the 248-9081, 440 to 452 a.m. If that phone is found at the Miramar Memorial Hospital, would that validate your findings?
yes.
Is cell phone technology new?
No,
How long has it been around?
decades.
Okay. The materials and things that you were relying upon, how long have those been used?
A long time, more than a decade.
In terms of the difference between the 2.99 and 3 to the 10th, what types of difference in distance are you looking at when you're making those tiny advance bands?
So that's not a huge number, a huge difference between them, so that would be generally a small difference between the distance estimates there,
Are we talking meters or miles?
meters.
In terms of the distance, you said it's 39 meters plus or minus each direction from the center of that location.
Yes,
The specific location that's plotted is based on the location of the tower.
yes,
Is the tower a known quantity?
yes,
Does the tower move?
no. I mean, it can, but as of the records, no.
With regards to publications and trainings and things of that nature that you rely upon, are you trained in this area?
Yes,
What types of resources and materials are you used during your training with the FBI CAST analysis?
yeah, so instructors from Florida Institute of Technology who teach cellular theory and network engineering, network engineers from all the major service providers, other related fields, and like manufacturers, the ecosystem, and then also we have a lot of peer instruction as well.
In terms of if a child is kidnapped in Miami, are they gonna call an engineer to find them?
No, they'll probably call the police or the FBI.
council asked and brought up a lot of things about the distance and the measurements in the records. Is it possible to go through the CDRs or in the instance of the Sprint, or for example, the engineering report on the 9807 phone number, and highlight instances of exactly where on your records it corresponds with the records as provided from T-Mobile?
Yeah, we could go through line by line and say, here's the map that I made, here's how the corresponding line in the T-Mobile report is.
And in terms of the records and things that were sent to you, were they forwarded with a T-Mobile email address attached to them?
Yeah, I got them on a thumb drive, and they had the certification from T-Mobile or Sprint or whatever.
Okay. In terms of, there's a lot of discussion, I want to make sure it's clear for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury. When you were plotting some of these particular phones, specifically the Sprint ones, are you saying that these towers are the ones that would have been used if they were making a phone call?
No.
What are you saying?
These towers saw the phone.
Can you give any more indication on the direction or anything on that specific issue?
No, I mean, the direction, you can see the side of the tower that saw the phone, but that's it.
Has this type of analysis been used to solve crimes?
Yes,
Has it been used to locate missing persons?
yes.
Judge, I'm going to object because this line of question is outside of my cross-examination.
Hey, overruled.
In terms of the data that you rely on, have it been validated in your personal experience and training?
Yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Is this witness excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir. You may step down. Excuse me. Counsel, want to call your next witness?
Yes, Kurt Rhodes.
Good afternoon. Are you Kurt Rhodes?
Yes.
Welcome. Come on up. This is our witness stand here. When you get there, you can put your things down, remain standing, and raise your right hand and be sworn.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you should give in this case should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please state your full legal name for the record.
Kurt Rhodes,
Please spell your first and last name for the court reporter.
KURT, RHODES.
Thank you, sir.
Please have a seat. Mr. Rhodes, that microphone in front of you will adjust up or down, but it does not move back and forth, all right? Are you ready to proceed, sir?
Yes.
Counsel, you may.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Rhodes. How are you today?
I'm well, how are you?
Very well. Thank you for asking. Could you please introduce yourselves, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and tell them where you work?
My name is Kurt Rhodes. I am a DNA analyst. I work in the BSO Crime Laboratory as a DNA analyst.
And what are the qualifications to be an analyst in the BSO Crime Lab for DNA?
I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in Forensic Science from the University of Central Florida. I have completed the Sheriff's Office training program for DNA analysts. I hold certification from the ABC or American Board of Criminalistics in molecular biology. And I am required to complete at least 8 hours of continuing education per year.
And so how long have you been employed for the Sheriff's Office?
I began in 2004 as a DNA technician. I went into DNA training in 2005 and began DNA casework in 2007.
Can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what's the difference between a DNA technician, like you were in 2005, and when you transitioned to 2004, and transitioned to 2005 to be a DNA trainee?
As a technician, I would do instrument maintenance, quality control checks on the chemicals and reagents, do ordering, record keeping, things of that nature.
So you briefly mentioned a little bit of your educational background. What types of coursework and classes did you take when you were getting your initial degree from in the sciences?
The program that I did through the UCF was the DNA-based program for forensic science. So there was genetics, molecular biology, biochemistry. There was a statistics course, mainly the coursework towards the end of the degree requirements were mainly geared towards genetics and biochemistry and molecular biology.
So do you have specialized training using statistics to interpret DNA?
I have completed the statistics in my college coursework, and I have attended courses throughout my career in the Sheriff's Office dealing with statistics and how they relate to DNA case reform.
You mentioned that you're required to do 8 hours of continuing education. Is that on a yearly basis?
Yes, perfect.
And approximately how many hours of continuing education have you completed since 2005 when you started your DNA training?
It's at least 8 hours. Some of the courses, use the term loosely, range from 8 hours to 40 hours. So 1 year maybe 8 hours, another year maybe 48 or even 60. It just depends on the year.
So in terms of the DNA section that you work for, what does it do on a day-to-day basis?
As a DNA analyst, I examine evidence that's submitted by investigators in attempts to develop DNA profiles from question samples and ultimately compare them to known standards to see if the individual that is being investigated or even alleged victim would be included or excluded from the evidence that's submitted.
In terms of the DNA analysis, do you do that yourself, hands-on?
I do.
And the training that you started to talk about, you said you started training in 2005. Could you talk and explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what that training entails?
It entailed readings, hands-on processing of the samples that we did, time, extraction methods, quantitations. There was written tests as well as a mock court. Then there was it ended with a competency test to ensure that I was able to process samples appropriately, and then I was allowed to do supervised casework, and then finally independent casework.
So let's explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what is a competency test?
A competency test is given to an analyst after they have completed a training program for whatever subject. It could be as simple as an extraction method or maybe a quantitation method. So the laboratory would then provide a test that the analyst would conduct. They would process this test and return the results to the agency to see if the results that they've gotten were appropriate for what was doing.
And do you have to pass these competency tests or examinations before moving on to the next steps?
The competency tests are done to ensure that you are competent in the technology that is going to be employed in casework.
So once you pass that initial testing, is there additional yearly or biannual proficiency testing done?
As a DNA analyst, I am required to do 2 proficiency tests per year. In our laboratory, the agency will purchase proficiency tests from a provider. I process them, generate my results, my answers, and those are then sent back to the provider to ensure that I'm getting the correct answers.
Are those done in-house in terms of the scoring and completion of that proficiency testing twice a year?
I process it in-house, it's reviewed, and then it's sent back to the test provider.
Are Does the proficiency test require and include statistical interpretations?
They do.
And has the statistical interpretations changed as the way they've been doing in the field of DNA over the last couple of years?
In my laboratory, yes. It went from statistical calculation with known as random match probabilities, single source samples, and CPIs, which were combined probability of inclusion. We've transitioned from those two methods to a likelihood ratio method.
And can you explain, in as simple of terms as possible, what is a likelihood ratio?
Likelihood ratio is a comparison of two hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 compared against hypothesis 2. In terms of casework analysis, the initial hypothesis is that a person is included as a contributor to a sample, and the competing hypothesis is that the evidence or the DNA profile is coming from an unrelated unknown individual. So that is how the likelihood ratio is set up. Person 1 or person of interest is the contributor to the evidence versus it's coming from an unknown, unrelated individual.
Okay. So I want to go back, and so can you describe to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, when you're doing a DNA analysis, what is it that you're looking for?
For the analysis that I'm doing, I am processing for STRs, or short tandem repeats. These are small fragments of DNA that are located in our DNA genome. They repeat a certain number of times. When I first began DNA casework, I was processing 15 STRs plus the amelogenin or sex-determining marker, and now the technology has gone to 24 STRs.
So when you say short tandem repeat or STRs, do they code for something like eye color or hair color?
These are non-coding fragments of DNA.
Why is it important to look at those areas as opposed to eye color?
The locations that we're testing, or that I'm testing for, the locations that I'm processing, they're robust. They're polymorphic, meaning that there are differences. There's not just 1 or 2 variations. There could be 10 to 12 different variations, and they are independent from each other, meaning that the result that I get at location 1 will not affect the result that I would get at location 2, or the DNA profile at location 1 isn't affected by the DNA profile of location 2.
Is that a genetic marker? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. And just so it's clear, can you define exactly what a genetic marker is from the DNA analyst perspective?
As it relates to what I do, it is the STO, the short tandem repeat. That is the specific DNA fragment or DNA marker that I'm processing or testing for.
Can you explain what an allele is?
The allele is the genetic trait or characteristic. In terms of STRs, as I mentioned, they're short fragments of DNA that repeat. So they're measured in numbers. At location, I'm just going to say location 1, an allele or characteristic of gene may be a 7, or an 8, or a 9, or an 11. So a DNA profile that I generate is actually just a series of numbers based off of the alleles or traits that I obtain at each DNA location.
You said they're identified by numbers. What does that mean? Could you explain like where the numbers, what do you say? Is it 274? Is it 11?
As I mentioned, the 7, 8, or 9, that refers to the number of repeats. So with the STRs, it's a repeated fragment of DNA, ATCG, and that ATCG may repeat a certain number of times. It may repeat 7 times, or 8 times, or 9 times. And so that is what those numbers that I'm expressing represent.
And where does that repeat, how does that show up in a person's individual DNA?
It is located on the DNA chromosome.
And what determines what makes up an individual's DNA chromosome?
In In the case of humans, our DNA is inherited from our parents. We receive half of our DNA from our mother and half from our father. And with the exception of identical twins, no two individuals are going to share the exact same DNA.
In terms of your casework and the DNA process that you do, has that been validated?
Yes,
Is the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab accredited?
it is.
And by what outside accredited body?
We are accredited by ANAB, or the ANSI National Accreditation Board.
What's the purpose of maintaining an accreditation as a lab?
The accreditation is a voluntary process. The accrediting board will do an audit on our laboratory. It will check our SOPs, or standard operating procedures, to ensure that we are doing proper record keeping, we are following the procedures that we have in place, and that the laboratory is essentially running as it is supposed to be according to the SOPs.
And in terms of the specific areas in which the lab is accredited for, are you only talking on DNA?
It's accredited in 4 different sections: DNA, firearms, chemistry, and fingerprints.
Have you worked in any of those other sections?
I have not.
In terms of the proficiency testing that we talked about earlier, is that also part of the accreditation process?
Yes, everything that is done in the laboratory will be audited through the accredited body.
And is there also accreditation and validation in terms of statistics that are used?
Again, it's part of the audit.
You mentioned that you used to do 15 areas plus Amylogen, and now you're at 24 areas. Can you explain what made that change occur?
The DNA analysis is a science, and as the years go on, the science advances. So the companies that provide these commercial kits are able to make combinations of these STRs in a bigger multiplex, that's what it's identified as, to analyze more DNA locations all at once in order to provide a better picture compared to years prior when it may have only been 9 locations.
With regards to the locations, does the software take into account the frequency then, or the number of times a particular repeat is found in a population?
I'm not sure of your question.
And previously, when you were doing random population, random maps, or CPI, is it important to know how frequently a specific allele was shown up in a population of individuals?
Yes. At the end of the analysis, if I am, let me start over again. After I look at the evidentiary samples, I'll determine if it's a single source profile or a mixture, and then do a comparison to a known standard. If I am going to report that the known standard is included as a contributor, I am required to give a weight to this. And in order to give a weight to this match or inclusion, I am required to provide a statistical calculation. So years prior, as I mentioned, it was RNP or CPI. We've gone to likelihoods now. But all of those different calculations or those statistics are based on allele frequencies. And what that means is those STR markers that I mentioned before occur in the population at different frequencies. So I mentioned allele 8 may occur at a frequency of 25% of the population has it. And allele 7 may occur at 15%. So when I do a statistical calculation with all of the alleles present in the DNA profile compared to the standard, all of those frequencies are used to calculate the end result, whether it's an LR, a CPI, or an RNP.
So while you change your method, you're still using a lot of the same and building on the same items that you've used in the past.
Yes, that's right.
Has the likelihood ratio, or LR, been validated for statistical analysis?
Yes, it is.
Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury about how in the lab, you prevent any sort of cross-contamination?
When I process evidence, I am processing one case at a time, and when I refer to that, screening evidence. So the initial step is to look at the evidence that I am receiving from our central evidence supply to ensure that the seals were intact. I will do an inventory of the evidence compared to the submission form and property receipts. Typically, the items are packaged all together, kind of like a big brown bag. I'll open that bag up and do an inventory. And then again, process one evidentiary sample at a time while leaving the other samples in a drawer or a cabinet.
What do you do in between each sample to your workstation?
And the workstation is cleaned with bleach and alcohol. As I'm doing my screening, I do wear a lab coat, gloves. I work in what's called a dead air box, a big plexiglass box about the size of this bench here. And I do all my processing on the bench. I'll clean that up after I'm done with the evidence, change my gloves, and then move on to the next piece of evidence. When the next step would be extraction, which would be after I've taken my sample and my cutting of this evidence, I place it into a tube and try and elute out or purify any DNA present that's on that sample. At that point, I'm working little test tubes. So I would again be changing gloves, wearing a lab coat, a mask, and I would only be working with one sample at a time, or only open it one sample at a time to avoid sample contamination.
In terms of, you mentioned the test tubes, are those sealed?
Yes.
So you talked about how you get evidence and it's brought to you. Does the lab assign a specific case number at the lab to track all items of evidence and samples?
Yes. When the investigator brings the evidence to the evidence window or the central receiving, there's a property receipt and a submission form that's brought in, accepted by the evidence intake unit, and it is given a laboratory number.
When you receive evidence, you mentioned you check the seals. Why do you do that?
I check the seals. It's an indication if the evidence has been tampered with. There is a chain of custody form with property receipts, and it lists who had custody of the evidence, and then basically from which person to which person it's transferred to.
And where is the evidence stored before you go and retrieve it?
For the most times, it is stored in the evidence vault. There's some cases where the evidence intake unit keeps it up front in their area, in the safe. But the majority of times, they have an evidence vault in which I go to retrieve the evidence.
So we've talked a lot about DNA and kind of the process leading up to that. What about serology? Is that a part of your job as well?
Serology is one of the first steps that I do when I'm screening the evidence. With each case that's submitted, there's an evidence submission form. It gives me an idea of the type of evidence that I'm going to be processing. Sexual assaults. Years prior, I would screen for semen, looking for sperm cells. Maybe the case has indications of blood, at which point I would do presumptive testing for blood. Items of evidence are submitted where the investigator is just looking for what's essentially called contact DNA, where an individual had come into contact with maybe an item left at the scene. There's no real serology to do on that one, but I would just take cuttings of the samples.
So, Mr. Rhodes, I want to make sure it's clear. Is it your job to go out and collect DNA evidence?
No, I do not do any of the collection. The evidence is submitted and I retrieve it from the evidence vault.
Do you give any advice on where to collect evidence from?
I do not.
Have you ever been any training in crime scene or evidence collection?
I have.
In terms of your employment at the sheriff's office, have you ever worked outside of the forensic DNA section?
I have not.
How many times approximately have you done the DNA analysis process we're going to talk about?
I was processing about 100 cases per year. I would say roughly 2 to 3 samples per case, so maybe 200 to 300 samples per year. for a good 10 years, so thousands of samples and processing.
And in that time, have you had the opportunity to testify in court?
I've testified in Broward County about 40 times, and in the federal district 3 times.
Mayor, offer to defense for voir dire?
No need, no objection.
Proceed, Gus.
Okay, so I want to start with, in this particular case, did you do DNA analysis?
I didn't.
Could you please describe for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury the step-by-step process you go through? You started talking a little bit about extraction. You could pick up there and continue.
So again, the first step would be a screening of the evidence to collect my samples, which I would then put in 2 small, essentially test tubes, little microcentrifuge tubes. I would add reagents or chemicals to the tube in order to elute out any potential DNA that's present on the sample and to purify any DNA that may be present in that cut.
Should we approach for just one moment?
Yes. Discuss the case, don't form any opinion about the case, don't allow anyone to discuss the case in the presence of person or research, just leave your note page on your chair. Thank you. Thank you. Let the record reflect the jury stepped down. Counsel remain along with the defendant. Our witness remains on the stand. Is everything all right?
Yeah, we just need a moment, Your Honor.
Okay. You need a restroom break, Mr. Devens? Yes? Can we arrange that for Mr. Devens, please?
Yes, Joe.
All right, we'll be in recess. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I could tell the witness why we're taking a break. Unless you're wrong with that. They were being loud.
We're in
and
recess.
following.
I object to this. They're telling me.
Why, what's that?
I said no.
Oh, I thought you.
No, I said no.
see if the jury's ready?
Yes, Judge.
Oh, Stu, you didn't do this witness, may I bother you for a moment? As a demonstrative only. This is just an example of the paragraphs for demonstrative purposes.
Could you like make some jokes while you're up there? I'm not gonna have nothing. I did too.
You ready?
One in a row. First one.
While we're waiting, I want to say that the BSO officers that are in this courtroom have been very cooperative and helpful, and I thank them all, except for Gary, of course.
Call the guy with the AC.
Again, Gary, over here, we think you're awesome.
Thank you. That side of the table. This side, nah. Huh? I don't blame you.
His counsel and the assistant state attorneys, the jury's still in the jury room. I understand, counsel, I overheard you said you're going to use a demonstrative.
Yes, sir, I showed it to defense counsel already.
And I have no objection.
Thank you.
And you'll give that instruction on demonstrative evidence.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Seven.
Jury entering.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Please be seated. Let the record once again reflect the presence of the jury, the defendants, his counsel, the assistant state attorney, or witness remains on the stand. And when we broke, I think counsel, you're going to use your continue with your direct examination. Is that correct?
Correct, Your Honor.
All right, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Rhodes. Okay, we talked about, you discussed what is extraction. Next, so is that, did you complete your discussion of what is the extraction step for DNA?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Extraction is when I'm trying to elute out and purify any potential DNA present in the samplings or cuttings that I've taken from the evidence. The next step would be quantitation, and that would be to determine how much DNA present, if any, is in the DNA extract, to then target a specific optimized amount of DNA for the amplification. Amplification is where I'm now going to be targeting those STRs, or those short tandem repeats, through a process called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, in order to make a detectable amount of DNA from that DNA extract, so that I could then go on to the last step of instrumentation, which is the detection phase using capillary electrophoresis.
So I want to go back and we talked about the PCRs, the polymerase chain reaction. Does that change the underlying DNA sample in any way?
It does not. It's simply there to make a amount of DNA that can be detectable on an instrument.
And why do you do that?
That is the basis for the DNA typing that I do.
And the PCR typing that you're talking about, how long has that been used?
That's been for about several decades. It's used in mass disaster identifications, paternity testing, in the medical field.
How long has the process of DNA analysis and identification been used?
Again, it's been decades. STRs came around in the 90s, the middle to late 90s. So for 30 plus years, PCR has been employed.
Again, it's been a little while since high school biology, can you explain how DNA comes to be in an individual person?
As I mentioned, you receive half from your mother, half from your father. The woman has the egg and the man has the spermatozoa. Each of those cells has half from each parent, and it combines to form the child.
So is it always the first allele in any allele pair always comes from mom and the second one always comes from dad?
No. So the way that the allele table is organized is the smallest allele or number, comma the biggest allele number. I would only know which allele came from which parent by doing a comparison to the known parents. But there's things called recombination that take place during reproduction. So it's basically just a random sampling of the parents' DNA when those reproductive cells are formed to then make the offspring.
In terms of your DNA analysis, do you take into account siblings?
Siblings do come up from time to time. Best way would be to request a standard for comparison.
With regards to a sibling, or if you thought a sibling was involved, is that something you could tell from the data?
There is significant sharing between siblings. So if an analyst, myself or any of my coworkers comes across a case where there is the potential that there could be a sibling, that information can be relayed to the investigator.
And I want to talk about, so it's clear, what is a standard when it comes to DNA?
A standard is a sample that's collected from a known individual. As I mentioned early on, the purpose of my analysis is to compare evidentiary or question samples collected at an alleged crime scene to a known standard or to a known person to see if that person is included or excluded as a contributor to any DNA left, again, at the potential scene.
In terms of how you're expressing your conclusion, are you expressing it in terms of it's more likely to be this individual than an unknown, unrelated individual?
Very similar, very close. I issue a report, and the wording is that the evidentiary sample is X times more likely to have originated from the person of interest than if it had originated from an unknown, unrelated individual. And when those samples become mixtures, then it becomes a little bit more wordy. That's the intent of it.
So going into, you talked about the unknowns and the standards. Is that related to you in some form when the evidence is presented to you?
Yes, it has to be.
Why is that important?
It's important so that I know exactly what evidence is questioned and what is a standard. The evidentiary samples are processed separately from the known samples to avoid any sort of contamination.
When you say separately, do you mean separate workstations, separate times? Can you define that for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury as to what you do to separate them?
I will process the question samples first, and then I do work in extraction batches. So several cases of question samples will be extracted, amplified, and put on the instrument together. And then I'll work a set of known samples, again, separate from the question samples at different times and spaces.
Is it separate by days?
Not always, but there are chances, or there are times where it is separated by days, but it's definitely separated by time.
So the last step of the process that you were talking about, the capillary electrophoresis. What is that?
That is the step where I put the amplification product. I take a small portion of the amplification product and inject it onto an instrument. And what that's doing is it applies an electric charge to this little liquid to essentially suck up the DNA that's present from that amplification. And it runs through a little thin, tiny straw, so you have a visual, a capillary. And the DNA fragments are separated by the size, because all of the STRs have to be detectable and they all can't be the same size. So as they migrate through this capillary or little tiny straw, there is a fluorescent tag that is present on each of these DNA fragments. A laser will excite that fluorescent tag, it emits light, and that light is captured. But again, the DNA fragments migrate or travel through that little capillary based on the size. The smaller ones will migrate faster, and the larger ones will migrate slower.
Is this captured in some sort of a chart or diagram that's then presented?
The samples are collected, and then they're analyzed through a program, and then I do have printouts. They're called electropharograms.
So with Your Honor's permission for a demonstrative as to what an electropharogram looks like.
Okay, is there any objection?
No objection.
All right, again, ladies and gentlemen, the witness will be using a demonstrative to assist in explaining or illustrating his testimony. Please remember that the testimony of the witness is the evidence. However, the demonstrative is not to be considered by you as evidence in the case unless it's later received in evidence, and it should not be used as a substitute for evidence. Only items of evidence received will be available to you for consideration during your deliberation. So at this time, this is not in evidence, it's demonstrative.
Mr. Rhodes,
Proceed.
may I? Your Honor? Mr. Rhodes, can you explain kind of what this chart is?
So this is an electropharogram. This is one of the pages. They typically go on 2 or 3 pages based on whether it's a single source or a mixture profile. As you see across the top, there's some red boxes. And
So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so it's easier
Sure.
to see.
There's these red boxes, and then you'll see a bunch of letters and numbers. To the left, you'll see D8S1179. That is one location that I am testing for. It's on the 8th chromosome. I would call it D8 for short. And as you go across to the right, you'll see D21 for short, D18 for short. And these are the locations, or these are the specific STRs that I'm analyzing.
In terms of you said it's a D8, is that the address of where this STR is located?
That's essentially what that is. It's location on the chromosome, the 8th chromosome, and then the S1179 gives a more specific location on where it's located.
Can you describe that like in terms of a house address? If the address is 123 Main Street of a house, how would that correspond that to what you're looking at here?
The best I can do is, again, it's on D8 would mean that's DNA on the 8th chromosome, and the S1179 gives a more specific location on that chromosome. Again, we have 23 chromosomes, so there are multiple chromosomes.
And do you test and sequence every single marker on every single chromosome when you're doing DNA analysis?
No, it is only the select set of STRs that is used for each specific commercial kit. And in this particular kit, I use what's called global filer,
And what is global filer?
this specific DNA kit used for these STRs.
And how many specific locations are you testing for in global filer?
There are 24.
So in terms of the specific evidence that you did in this case, I want to kind of just go in order with your reports, if that's okay. The items that were submitted to you and processed on that. I'm going to start with the lab number items 16 and 17. If you need to refer to your report,
Yes. Okay.
okay, so items 16 and 17, was there a description attached to those items?
There was. Yes.
And where do you get the description from?
The description comes from the property receipt as well as the evidence packaging.
If there is a discrepancy between the property receipt and the evidence packaging, do you note that?
Yes.
So starting with 16 and 17, what description were you given as to where that swab originated?
These are oral swabs coming from Cortland Henry. Item 16 is the right side and item 17 is the left side.
Do you test both of them?
I did not. I tested one.
Why don't you test both of them?
It's a buccal swab or oral swab coming from the same individual. There's not going to be a difference in DNA based off the left side of his cheek or the right side of his cheek.
So when you test item 16, can you explain to ladies and gentlemen and the jury how you go through that process?
It is, again, what I mentioned before. I would screen it, do an extraction, quantify it, do an amplification, and then develop the DNA profile and use it as a DNA standard for Mr. Henry.
Moving on to item number 18. Did you test in that particular item, develop a DNA profile?
I did.
And the DNA profile assigned to item number 18 was what?
It is a DNA spot card from Christopher Thomas.
And in terms of what is a DNA spot card?
It's a blood stain collection card taken from the medical examiner.
And as to item number 19, the next item, did you test and develop a DNA standard or profile from item 19?
I did. Yes.
And what was that?
It was a DNA spot card from Mr. Anthony Williams.
Going forward to item number 20, what was that?
It was identified as swab from water bottle PM number 18.
Do you know where that water bottle was?
I do not.
Did you do the DNA analysis on that particular item?
I did. Yes.
And can you explain what conclusions you drew on that item?
The DNA profile obtained from item number 20 was uninterpretable due to insufficient data.
Can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what does it mean by insufficient data?
After I do the analysis of any DNA product, after I run it through calculated electrophoresis and look at the electrophoregram, I look at the data and I have to determine, is there enough data to determine the number of contributors? Is this a single source profile? Is this a two-person profile? Or a two-person mixture? Is it a three-person? After looking at the results, I deemed that there wasn't enough information to even determine how many number of contributors were in the profile. So I deemed it insufficient or uninterpretable.
So does that mean there wasn't DNA there?
It means that there was DNA, but I was unable to make any sort of comparison.
You mentioned that you have to determine the number of contributors. What would help you determine the number of contributors to a DNA item?
The number of contributors, it's based off of the DNA results. One of the things that I look at is the number of alleles that are present. As I mentioned, we receive half of our DNA from our mother, half from our father. So at a specific location, I would expect to only find a maximum of 2 different alleles per location. So if I'm looking at, let's say, D8, as you had seen and there was 3 alleles or 3 different peaks present, it's a pretty good indication that it's coming from at least 2 individuals. If I had seen 4 peaks or 4 alleles, maybe 5 alleles, now there's a potential that there's 3 people that could be contributing to this profile. And after I do an overall analysis of the entire literature paragraph, I will then come to a determination of whether it's 2 or 3.
So when you're said overall, do you look at each area or each address you're looking at individually?
Individually at first, and then overall to get the final interpretation.
And is that something you have training and experience in doing?
Yes.
How often do you have to analyze mixtures as part of your DNA casework?
Mixtures usually come up, I would say, at least half of the time, and DNA samples that are processed.
Okay. So going on to what was labeled for your DNA report as item number 21, what was that listed as?
It's listed as swab from spent casing blazer 40 S&W PM number 18.
Were you able to get any DNA results from item number 21?
I was not.
Why not?
There wasn't sufficient DNA present in the extract to obtain DNA results on the electrophoregram after I did the amplification.
Okay, going on to item number 22. What was that described as?
Swab from Gucci sandals, PM number 19.
On number 22, were you able to determine the contributors on that particular swab?
That result was interpreted as a mixture originating from 3 contributors.
And were you able to identify the 3 contributors?
I was not.
In terms of, are you able to say and give a statistic as to each of the 3 individuals that you identified on item 22 as to their likelihood of being a contributor to that mixture?
Yes. So every sample that is deemed to be conclusive or whether interpretable single source mixture, I would then do a comparison to any known samples submitted. So each of the 3 individuals were compared against this mixture.
And were you able to determine whether or not you can give support to Christopher Thomas being included in that mixture?
Yes, the DNA results are 4,730 times more likely if they originated from Christopher Thomas and 2 unrelated unknown individuals than if they originated from 3 unrelated unknown individuals. And this provides moderate support that Christopher Thomas is included as a contributor.
So this is the first time, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have heard moderate support. Can you explain what the verbal qualifiers are that you're going to be testifying and using to describe the DNA results?
Yes, the likelihood ratio can go from really small numbers. The resulting likelihood ratio number can go from really small to really large. So I will have a verbal qualifier listed on the report, and it goes from limited support, moderate support, strong support, and very strong support. And this tries to give a scale to the number that you're hearing.
And so the numbers that you're going to be talking about are exponential at sometimes.
That's correct.
If it's the opposite direction, if it's an exclusion, what type of number, what type of words would you be using?
If it's an exclusion, which is really, there's a chance that there's a small likelihood for exclusion, and at that point it would be limited support for exclusion, or it would just be a straight exclusion with no verbal qualifier.
So going back to item 22, you said moderate support as to Christopher Thomas.
That's correct.
Okay. And did you also analyze that with regards to the individual that was identified as Anthony Williams?
I did, yes.
And so what was the likelihood ratio that Anthony Williams was a contributor to the DNA found on those samples?
The DNA results are at least 3.07 times 10 to the 25th, or 30.7 septillion. Time is more likely if they originated from Anthony Williams and 2 unrelated unknown individuals than if they originated from 3 unrelated unknown individuals.
With regards to the individual that was identified as Cortland Henry, what conclusions were you able to draw with regards to him and that DNA sample?
He was excluded as a contributor.
So you said 30.7 septillion. How many zeros is that?
There are 25 zeros after the 3.
Why is it that you don't say it's Anthony Williams, Chris Thomas, and some unknown individual?
Sometimes that is reported if it's requested. The likelihood ratio that I'm reporting on now is done on an individual basis. So I would conduct or calculate the likelihood ratio of the first individual, report the number, do a likelihood calculation of the second individual, report the number. And if it's requested, an additional calculation can be done and reported in which both individuals would be included in the mixture.
So I want to make sure it's clear. You're looking at each contributor individually,
Yes,
and that is because it's the hypothesis is either however many times more likely that they are versus that they are not included.
could you say that again?
You're making me do math. So with regards to the likelihood ratio, the first hypothesis is the number that you come out with, or the number you're reporting. If it is the 30.7 septillion times more likely that they are included, that's the first hypothesis, that they are there and they are a contributor. The second hypothesis is that they are not. So you're saying that it is 30.7 septillion times more likely they are a contributor than they are not, than they are excluded.
Sort of. I would explain it as, again, these likelihood ratios are, it's a calculation that's going against 2 competing hypotheses. So there is more support that Mr. Williams, in this case, would be included along with 2 other unknown, unrelated individuals than if the DNA results were coming from 3 unrelated, unknown individuals.
Okay. And so for item 22, the swab from the Gucci sandals, you had testified Cortland Henry was excluded.
That's correct.
Okay. Moving on to item number 23. What was that?
It's listed as a cutting blood stain on front of T-shirt. Drew, I'm not sure how to say this, Drew Filmedit C G10.
Okay, going on to item number 23, the cutting from the front of the T-shirt. What were your results on that?
The DNA results were interpreted as a mixture originating from 2 contributors.
Okay.
After doing the comparisons to each individual, the DNA results are at least 982 times more likely if they originated from Christopher Thomas and 1 unrelated unknown individual than if they originated from 2 unrelated individuals. And this provides moderate support that Mr. Thomas is included as a contributor.
And then with regards to Anthony Williams.
The DNA results are 3.22 times 10 to the 25th, or 32.2 septillion. Time is more likely if they originated from Mr. Williams and 1 unrelated unknown individual than if they originated from 2 unrelated individuals. And this provides a very strong support that Mr. Williams is included as a contributor.
982 and 32.2 septillion. That's a big difference.
Yes, and that's, again, one of the reasons that the verbal qualifier is put into the report.
In terms of identifying and making a conclusion based on that. Is there anything that you take into account as to the amount of DNA that's in there?
The DNA mixtures that are analyzed at the laboratory that I analyze, I use a program called StarMix, or STRMix. And this is a program that helps to deconvolute these mixtures. And what deconvolute means is to determine if you have two contributors in a mixture, are you able to tease out or generate essentially who the first contributor would be compared to who the second contributor would be. As the amount of DNA is increased in these DNA extracts and these amplification products, the result becomes more robust, and you would have a more solid comparison, or an easier comparison, maybe that might be the right word. If you have a full single source DNA profile, it's a lot easier to compare to a standard than if you had a really partial DNA profile. And once you start compounding that into a mixture, if you have essentially two partial DNA profiles mixing into one stain, which would then make this partial two-person mixture, doing comparisons may lead to likelihood ratios that are on the lower side, versus if you had two robust DNA profiles, or two robust DNA sources of DNA making a mixture, and then the likelihood ratios may result in a number that's far larger and more support for the inclusion.
Okay, so I'm going to make sure it's clear. If you have 1 gallon of blood from one individual and 1 drop of blood from another individual, is that still, you can get out 2 profiles?
There is a potential, yes, but again, it depends on the overall result.
Would that come across in the data that you're looking at?
Absolutely.
And how would that read out in the data?
When I look at a DNA profile, mixture profile, you can see, or oftentimes you can see that there is one contributor that is contributing or providing more genetic material to the mixture versus the second contributor or third contributor. So you'll see differences in the peak heights or the alleles or the characteristics as you go across the electrophotogram. And I can look and see, hey, this looks like a 2-person mixture. This one contributor is providing more DNA material than this other contributor.
As to item number 23, can you say which individual contributed more genetic material to that cutting on the front of the t-shirt Drew filmed it?
I cannot specifically say that, but the likelihood ratio would provide the verbal qualifier that there's very strong support that Mr. Williams was included as the mixture, or to the mixture.
So going, and then in terms of, did you also analyze that cutting against Cortland Henry?
I did. Mr. Henry was excluded as a contributor.
So I want to also take a moment here to talk about different types of DNA and serology. Did you do serology on this particular item, item 23?
I did, yes. I did a presumptive test for the indications of blood, and it was positive.
If there are blood genetic material and epithelial genetic material, does that change your analysis in any way if you know they're commingled?
No.
And why not?
If a stain has potential blood on it, I'm going to take a cutting or a sampling based off of that size of that blood stain, because I can't saturate my DNA extract with all the blood DNA or DNA from the blood stain in hopes that I obtain enough, or there is any second contributor from any potential epithelial cells. And epithelial cells are basically the skin cells on the outside surfaces of your body. So if I were to rub this bench top here, deposit some of my DNA from my skin cells from my hand, and then there's a blood stain that comes up next to it. If the investigator swabs this, essentially this mixture of my DNA plus the blood stain, The blood is going to, for the most part, cover up or provide a majority of that DNA because the blood is a far richer source of DNA than the skin cells.
Is a person's DNA the same in every cell in their body?
It is.
So going on to now item number 23. What is that described as? I'm sorry, 24. We just finished 23. Item 24, what is that described as?
The cutting blood stain on rear of t-shirts, Drew Phil Medit, CG10.
Did you do a DNA analysis on item number 24?
I did. It was interpreted as originating from a single male contributor.
And were you able to make a reasonable or a likelihood ratio as to which individual contributed to that blood stain?
I did the comparisons to the 3 individuals. The DNA results are at least 1.59 times 10 to the 25th, or 15.9 septillion times more likely if they originated from Mr. Thomas, Christopher Thomas, than if they originated from one unrelated, unknown individual.
Were you able
Mr. Henry and Mr. Williams were excluded as contributors.
That's my next question. So with regards to item number 25, were you able to conduct a DNA analysis of that item?
I did.
What was that item identified to you as?
Swab, bloodstain, G12, Air Jordan, sneaker E.
Were you able to come to a conclusion as to the source of that bloodstain?
I obtained a DNA profile and interpreted it as originating from a single male contributor. Mr. Williams, where all 3 individuals were compared, in comparison to Mr. Anthony Williams. The results are at least 5.3 times 10 to the 25th, or 53 septillion, times more likely if they originated from Anthony Williams than if they originated from one unrelated, unknown individual. Mr. Henry and Mr. Thomas were excluded as contributors.
So I want to move on to the next report that you did. In terms of the crime lab and how it works, when evidence is submitted to the lab, is it submitted in batches from the investigative agencies?
When evidence is submitted, we have a submission policy. So based off of the type of incident that's being investigated, there's essentially a number of items that can be submitted. In the cases of homicides, there are typically 10 to 12 items per testing round is what we call it. We want the investigators to provide the most probative evidence for their investigation first, and then move on after that. With the cases of maybe a non-suspect burglary case, you may only get 2 evidence items worth.
In terms of limits on homicide cases, is there any limit to the number of items that can be worked?
There's no limit as far as I know. Again, it's worked in a series of samples so that 100 or 150 items aren't submitted all at once. Again, to try and have the investigator determine which would be the most probative evidence for the investigation.
And in terms of your role in that process, do you know the underlying facts of the investigation as it's progressing?
Sometimes yes, but mostly no. I'm typically just assigned the case. There may be some communications between the unit supervisor and the investigator as to why more evidence is being submitted or reasons why the investigator is requesting more evidence.
Okay. In front of you, there's a stack of items that have already been admitted into evidence. If I may approach, Your Honor.
Yes.
We've talked about a few already here. Do you recognize the green sticker on this item that's already been admitted as State 58?
May I hold?
Please.
Yes, ma'am.
And how do you recognize that?
On the back, it has my laboratory number, my initials, and all the item numbers as they were submitted to the laboratory.
And do you then assign the individual numbers that we talked about?
Yes, the numbers are assigned based off our record-keeping system. They're a sequential number, so the first item gets number 1, and then sequentially down the line.
Okay. Moving on to what's been placed into evidence as States 53. Again, do you recognize that item?
I do. Again, it has my laboratory number, my initials, and my item numbers marked on it.
What's been previously admitted into evidence as States 33. Do you recognize that item?
I do. Again, it has all my markings on it.
Okay. As to what has been admitted as States 46.
Yes, again, the items are marked and my notations are on the evidence.
Okay. And as to item States 32. Did you ever get this one?
I don't think so.
So the answer is no.
No, I do not, because my markings are not on here.
Okay. As to what's been admitted as States 26. Have you reviewed that item?
Yes, I have.
Is that
I've
okay?
marked it and with my laboratory item numbers and my initials.
So I'm approaching with what's been previously marked as States GG for identification purposes only. Okay, I'm showing you what's been previously marked as States GG for identification purposes only. Do you recognize that item? Please. It is open.
Yes, it has my markings on it, case number, item numbers, initials.
Did you analyze the items inside of that package?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Hold on just a moment. So showing defense counsel, it's been marked as States triple T. For- Showing you what's been marked as States triple T for identification purposes only. Do you recognize that item?
I do. It again has my information marked on the outside.
And did you collect that item?
No, I did not collect it.
Is that an item that you analyzed?
Yes.
Okay, and we'll come back to that. Thank you so much. So all of the items that we're looking at here, Mr. Rhodes, are packaged in paper bags.
Or manila envelopes, yes.
Why is that?
The investigators use these types of evidence packaging in case the evidence is wet. It helps to allow air to get through the package to dry it. One of the things that will cause issues, degradation, is essentially having a biological stain remain wet, and mold, mildew, and bacteria will grow on it and potentially destroy any DNA that's present.
Is it important to keep DNA in a dry environment for preserving it?
Yes.
Is there limits on the temperature range in which the DNA is kept at the evidence vault?
There's no limits. The evidence vaults in the laboratories are around 60 degrees, maybe 65. We do have freezers that we have old cases. So as long as the evidence is kept cool and dry, and being frozen is cool and dry, the DNA will persist for decades.
In terms of if the DNA is heated, would that cause degradation to it?
Yes, heat, moisture, and sunlight are three of the main factors that will cause degradation and essentially destruction of the DNA present.
So why don't they just keep it in plastic bags?
The plastic won't allow any air to get through to the evidence, and it would basically cause condensation if it's moist. If the evidence is moist or wet, which would then lead to the mold, mildew, and bacteria growing.
Can one person's DNA change to become someone else's?
No.
How does it not, does air bring other DNA into those bags and samples?
No.
So going back now on to item number 26 that you processed. What was that identified as to you?
Swab from Yellow Jacket.
And there's another number that you list in your notes and reports of an 81. Where is that number coming from?
The first number, 26, is the item number that is generated in the laboratory when I am doing inventory in my inventory system. The 81 is the agency number as it's submitted on the property receipts.
Okay. So going on to item number 26, did you analyze the swab of the yellow jacket as it's described?
I did, yes.
And what were your conclusions on that particular item?
The results were interpreted as a mixture originating from 4 contributors.
So were you able to make determinations as to the standards that you had?
I did, yes.
Okay, we could discuss first with regards to Anthony Williams. What conclusion did you reach and what statistical basis for that?
He was included as a contributor to the mixture. And the likelihood calculation, the results are at least 2.05 times 10 to the 8th, or 205 million. Times more likely if these DNA results originated from Anthony Williams and 3 unrelated unknown individuals, than if they originated from 4 unrelated unknown individuals.
In terms of a 4-person mixture, do you expect the statistics to be a little bit lower, just based on that?
It depends on, again, when I was speaking of contribution, if a person is more represented in a sample, the statistics or likelihood calculation can be rather large. It just depends on how much contribution is in that mixture.
Were you able to exclude anybody from the swab of the yellow jacket, item 26?
Christopher Thomas and Cortland Henry were excluded.
In terms of item number 27, how was that, I'm sorry, yes, item number 27, how was that number identified to you?
Swab from Gatorade bottle.
Were you able to analyze that and develop DNA profiles?
I obtained a single source profile indicating male origin.
Were you able to determine the single source origin of that profile?
Christopher Thomas was included. The likelihood calculation is as follows. The DNA results are at least 1.65 times 10 to the 25th, or 16.5 septillion. Times more likely if they originated from Mr. Thomas than if they originated from 1 unrelated unknown individual.
Okay. Going on to item number 28, did you do the same?
I did.
And what was that listed as?
Swab from Gatorade bottle.
And that swab, who were you able to determine, or what DNA conclusions were you able to make?
The DNA results were interpreted as originated from a single male contributor. Mr. Anthony Williams was included. The likelihood calculation, the DNA results are at least 4.38 times 10 to the 25th, or 43.8 septillion times more likely if they originated from Anthony Williams than if they originated from 1 unrelated unknown individual.
At this point in everything that we have talked about, were you provided a standard for the defendant, Jamel Devins?
No.
So going on to item number 29, were you able to develop a DNA profile on that particular item?
I analyzed the results and deemed it to be uninterpretable due to limited data.
And what was item number 29?
It's listed as swab from bloodstain on rear passenger seat, PM number 1.
And you couldn't say where that was collected from?
I cannot.
Going on to your next report, I'm going to talk about the MVAC filter. Can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what is an MVAC filter?
An MVAC filter is a It's a filter paper where the investigator will essentially soak the surface of whatever they're looking for, maybe a shirt or a shoe or even a door, in a liquid, and they come back and they vacuum it up. And all of that vacuumed up liquid will then go and be deposited on the filter paper. That filter paper is then taken out of the apparatus, dried, and then I would take a portion of that filter paper and try and develop a DNA profile from the surface that they process.
Excuse me, I didn't hear the item number. What's the name back?
It's item number 31 of his report.
Thank you.
So on the MVAC filter, item 31, that you were asked to process in this case, what was your information relayed as to where that MVAC source was?
It's identified as MVAC filter 9 from spent casings found on ground at US 27 and Southwest 208th Avenue.
So we talked a little bit about things that are conducive to DNA. Does sunlight have an effect on it, you said, I believe, right?
Yes, it can.
What does sunlight do to DNA if exposed?
Again, with the heat, light, and moisture, it allows bacteria to grow and to essentially degrade the DNA.
And when you did an analysis of item number 31, the MVAC filter, what conclusions were you able to draw?
I did an extraction on the piece of evidence, and after quantitation, I determined that there was insufficient amount of extracted DNA to go forward. So I did not attempt to develop a DNA profile, and I stopped processing at that point.
And if you remind ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what does it mean if you stop it at that second step?
The extraction, meaning I would not obtain a DNA profile that could be used for any sort of comparisons. There just isn't enough genetic material in the extract.
What is the information, what are you relying on, and what training and experience to make that conclusion?
It's the quantitation results, the type of sample that I have obtained or that I analyzed. So I'm not surprised that MVACs from casings yielded very little DNA.
Moving on to your next report, item 32. Was that item provided to you for DNA analysis?
It was, yes.
And that is in evidence, I believe, if I may, as states 46.
Yes.
So if I may, published for the jury. So I'm publishing now states 46. What was states 46 purported to you to be?
These are oral swabs or standards from juvenile demons.
And with regards to item number 32 and 33 in your report, are they the same?
Item number 32 is listed as the right cheek, and 33 is listed as the left cheek.
Similar to we previously talked about, did you just pick one to test?
Correct, I did, just the first one.
Is there any rhyme or reason as to picking the right versus the left?
Nope.
Okay. Going on, and so once you got this standard, did you go back and look at the other evidence you previously analyzed?
Yes, so comparisons were made to all the previously analyzed questioned evidence.
So going to item number 22, the swab from the Gucci sandals. Were you able to compare the profile from Mr. Devens as opposed to the profile developed from those sandals?
I did, and he was excluded.
The blood stain on the front of the t-shirt, item number 23. Were you able to compare Mr. Devens' profile to that?
I did a comparison, and he was again excluded.
What about item number 24, the cutting on the blood stain of the rear of the t-shirt?
After comparisons were done, he was excluded.
Okay, then on item number 25, the swab of the blood stain from the Air Jordans.
Again, an exclusion.
Going on to item number 26, the swab from the yellow jacket.
An exclusion as well.
And in terms of the item number 27 and 28, the swabs at the Gatorade bottles, what were the results on that?
Those were both exclusions.
So going forward to what's been shown to you but not yet admitted into evidence for identification purposes is state's triple T. What was that item told to you to be?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. On your item 34, what's been shown to you for identification purposes only as state's triple T. What was that item described to you to be?
It's listed as a cutting of headliner.
And how did you analyze that particular piece of evidence?
That evidence, I had to do a visual examination on it and actually take a cutting of a potential blood stain.
And can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what's the difference between using it from a swab versus a cutting of an item?
This was a piece of evidence, a headliner. It was the size, maybe a foot squared. There were some small red brown stains on there. So there's oftentimes where the evidence itself is better to be submitted as opposed to moistening a cotton tip swab and then swabbing it, just in case the small blood stain becomes too diffuse on the cotton tip swab. And why that's important is I do my best to preserve evidence for future testing. So if an item of evidence is submitted, I typically process only half of the evidence. If there's only one swab submitted, I'll process half of the swab, leaving half for retesting either in current technologies by another laboratory or save it for future testing when technology has advanced even further. So if there's small potential blood stains, again, it might be beneficial to actually examine the evidence and take a cutting, as I did in this particular case.
Okay, and in terms of were you able to do an analysis and develop a profile on that particular item?
I did. I obtained a DNA profile originating from a single male contributor.
And were you able to identify the source of that single male contributor?
Mr. Anthony Williams was included as a contributor.
And what support can you assign to him being the contributor?
The likelihood ratio calculation, the results are 5.12 times 10 to the 25th, or 51.2 septillion times more likely if it originated from Mr. Williams than if it originated from one unrelated unknown individual.
Did you also do serology on that specific item?
I did. I did presumptive testing for blood, and it was positive.
When you're doing DNA testing on this, will you know without doing serology if something is epithelial or blood?
I would not know.
In this case, the serology indicated blood. And which test did you use to determine that?
I used a phenolphthalein test.
And were any individuals excluded from that sample?
Mr. Henry, Mr. Thomas, and Mr. Devins were excluded as contributors.
So moving on to item number 40. We're getting towards the end. With regards to item number 40, was that item submitted and analysis done?
Yes.
Okay. What was item number 40? What steps of the DNA process did you take it through as well?
Item number 40 was extracted for DNA, but after quantitation, there wasn't a sufficient amount of DNA to move forward, so I did not attempt to do any DNA profiling.
And what was item number 40 described as?
A contact swab of non-blood area of rear of driver's seat.
And after, is this the same discussion we had with regards to the last item? With not enough DNA, so then you stop it at that first step?
Correct, after extraction. Sure, after quantitation.
Why don't you at least try and take it through and go through all the steps?
Oftentimes the quantitation results in a 0, meaning none was detected. Sometimes it results in a null value, meaning not even less than 0 was obtained. So at that point, I'm pretty confident that I'm not going to obtain a DNA profile.
Do you do a control swab or sample as you're going through the DNA process each time?
The DNA processing has several controls. During extraction, I have a reagent blank, and this is just a sample of just the reagents by themselves. The extraction reagents that I use will be processed with the samples to ensure that the reagents are free of contaminants. When I do a amplification for PCR, there will be a positive control and a negative control. The negative control is again just a tube of reagents. There shouldn't be any DNA present at the end. And the positive control is a known DNA standard. And so after I do my amplification, the negative control needs to be blank, and the positive control needs to generate, or I need to generate the DNA profile from that positive control.
So let's go back. You mentioned reagents. I don't think we've defined that for the jury here today. What is a reagent?
Reagents are the chemicals that I use for my DNA processing.
Are they standard and part of the kit that you were talking about earlier?
There are different components in the amplification kit, quantitation kit. We have different reagents used for extraction. So at every step there are a set of reagents that we use.
And those are all related to the controls as well.
Correct.
So going back, so once we talked about that, let's start talking about item number 41. What was item 41 described to you as?
It's listed as blood swab of smear from rear of driver's seat.
Were you able to come to any sort of conclusion as to item 41?
I obtained some results, but I reported that they were uninterpretable due to limited data.
What does that mean?
Meaning I obtained at the electrophoregram stage, I've analyzed the ending result of that PCR amplification and deemed that there wasn't sufficient amount of DNA to make any comparisons.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to item number 66. Did you analyze that particular item?
I did.
And in terms of what was item number 66?
Item number 66 was initially reported as contact swab of rear of driver's side door handle interior.
Were you able to determine what the packaging of item number 66 said?
Yes, the contact swab of rear of driver's side door handle interior.
I'm sorry, on number 66 is which?
Front of driver's side door handle.
So you can't testify as to which it came from.
I'm not sure of the question.
You didn't collect this item of evidence.
No, I didn't.
Okay. So after reviewing the item and now, did you amend your report to read contact swab of front driver's side door handle interior?
That's correct.
Okay. So going on to item number 42, which is been labeled as item 66 by the Miramar Police Department. What results did you have?
Again, I obtained a DNA profile, but ruled it or determined it to be uninterpretable due to limited data.
Does uninterpretable mean no DNA?
In this case, no, there was DNA present, but it was insufficient amounts to make any sort of determination, number of contributors or even comparisons.
Are you still looking back at those same standards that we've talked about previously?
The interpretation of the question samples is done prior to looking at the interpretation of the knowns.
Why is that?
It's to avoid any sort of bias. I want to make my interpretation calls of those unknowns absent of knowing what the known standards are.
Does the computer do any of this analysis or say, hey, it's person A or person B for you?
No, it does not.
So moving on to item number 43. Is that the last item you tested in this case?
Yes.
So with regards to what was item number 43, listed as?
Swab, rear driver's side door, handle interior.
Were you able to do DNA testing on that particular item?
I did, yes,
Did you develop a profile?
I did.
And can you explain what DNA profile you developed?
In this particular case, I reported out both a 2-person mixture and a 3-person mixture.
And so explain why you would report out 2 different hypotheses.
When I did the initial interpretation of the question sample of this item 43, there was the appearance of a 2-person mixture. After doing a comparison to the known standards and doing the likelihood calculation, the result was essentially unintuitive. There was a lot of contribution being attributed to an individual, but then resulted in an exclusionary likelihood ratio.
So can you explain what that means in a little bit simpler math terms, if possible?
Yeah, essentially the likelihood ratio resulted in exclusion. So after talking with my technical leader, I determined, or we both came to the consensus that it would be best to report out or then interpret it as a 3-person mixture and then report out both results.
So with regards to when you're saying it's an exclusion, is there a certain number of loci that it has to not match for you to report it as an exclusion?
When it comes to likelihood ratios, as I have mentioned before, it's doing it's comparing 2 hypotheses, essentially that a person is included versus a person, an unrelated unknown individual is included. And it does this at every specific location. So going through all of those locations, there's the potential to have 16, 17, 18 locus-specific likelihoods, likelihood ratios. And at the end of it, those are all multiplied together to get the final result. So if one specific location results in a 0 likelihood ratio, but everything else is inclusionary, it's an indication that there's an issue with how the software was set up. And so as an analyst, I would go back and see what the issue was and then rerun this deconvolution and redo the calculations. In this particular case, after doing a visual comparison of the standards to the mixture and then looking at the resulting likelihood ratios, again, I spoke with the technical leader and we determined that there will be best to report out both.
So I'm going to go starting with the alternative proposition on that. Were you able to exclude anyone in the alternative proposition that you put forth?
Mr. Cortland Henry was excluded.
With regards to the initial proposition,
Cortland Henry, Anthony Williams, and Jamel Dimmons were excluded.
who was included on the initial proposition?
Christopher Thomas was included.
When you were looking at it as 2 contributors, how did you exclude the defendant, in this case, Mr. Dimmons?
How did I exclude him?
Yes.
So again, after doing the visual comparison and then running it through to generate the likelihood ratio, it resulted in an exclusionary likelihood ratio.
When you looked at it again as a 3-person mixture, were you able to make a determination as to whether or not Christopher Thomas was included as a source of that mixture?
Yeah, he was included as a 3-person as well.
And what were the statistics on the 3-person mixture for Christopher Thomas?
The results are at least 8.15 times 10 to the 24th, or 8.15 septillion times more likely if they originated from Christopher Thomas and 2 unrelated unknown individuals than if they originated from 3 unrelated unknown individuals.
In terms of, as to Cortland Henry, were you able to do the statistical calculations as to whether or not he was excluded on a three-person mixture on item number 43, swab of rear driver's side door handle material?
Yes, the results are at most 46, and this is an inverse LR calculation because the number was less than 1. So the DNA results are at most 46 times more likely if it originated from 3 unrelated unknown individuals than if it originated from Cortland Henry and 2 unrelated unknown individuals.
So is your conclusion that Mr. Henry is excluded from that sample?
Yes.
Okay. Going on to Anthony Williams, were you able to make a conclusion as to whether or not he was included or excluded?
I did. He was included. The LR calculation, the DNA results are at least 41.2 times more likely if they originated from Anthony Williams and 2 unrelated unknown individuals than if they originated from 3 unrelated unknown individuals.
And in terms of the verbal qualifier that you would give for Mr. Williams being included in that sample, what verbal qualifier would you give?
Limited support for inclusion.
Is that the lowest for inclusion?
Yes.
Okay. I believe I forgot to ask you with Christopher Thomas, what verbal qualifier would you give that he is included on that?
It is the highest at very strong support.
And at last but not least, were you able to analyze the profile of the defendant Jamel Demons in this case?
I did this.
And what was your conclusion in a three-person mixture as to the results of Mr. Demons being included or excluded?
He was included. The likelihood calculation, the DNA results are at least 2.12 times 10 to the 8th, or 212 million times more likely if they originated from Jamel Demons and 2 unrelated unknown individuals than if they originated from 3 unrelated unknown individuals.
And what verbal qualifier did you give to that particular item of
Very-
Mr. Demons being included?
There is very strong support for the inclusion.
Nothing further at this time, Your Honor.
May I?
If you're ready, you may proceed. Alvin? Sure. We'll take a short recess. Do not discuss the case. Don't form any opinion about the case. Don't allow anyone to discuss the case in the presence. Serving no research. Just leave your notepads on the chair. Now you let the order reflect the jury stepped out. Counsel may along with the defendant. Mr. Demings, need a restroom break?
Yes, sir.
Yes, can we arrange that?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. We're on recess.
judge called. It's warm though. It's 73.9 right now. Huh? No, Bradley brought it in.
Yeah.
73.8.
That was pretty funny. I think it's more, we're hitting it up.
You and me both. You and me. Do you know who you're calling tomorrow? I didn't. Either do I, but I want you to think I did. Yes. No, not even close.
What did you do to the air today?
I didn't do anything. 73.7.
No, it's hotter than that.
No, it's not. 73.7.
But I brought my jacket.
I don't know.
I brought my jacket.
If you want to utilize your jacket, go up to 6 or 7.
Go to his floor. Yeah, so in other words, don't go up there.
Yeah.
I just asked.
Oh, well, I'm going to ask you for documentary approval, and I'm assuming you will not agree to Zoom.
So, yeah, she wanted to know would you agree for Rebecca to appear over Zoom. I told her no, but she had to ask you, but.
No.
Jury entering. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Please be seated. Let the record once again reflect the presence of the defendants, evidence, his counsel, and assistant state attorneys. Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, our witness remains on the stand. Counsel, this is your opportunity for cross-examination. If you're ready, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm going to say good evening to you.
Yes,
Because I feel like it's nighttime today. By any chance, do you know George Bellow?
He is the unit supervisor for the firearms section.
Yeah. He gave us an education on firearms, and you've now given us an education on DNA. So he said he would give us some type of certificate. So I expect you also to get some type of certificate on DNA. But in any event, when did you perform your first DNA testing? The date, please.
May I refer to my notes?
Absolutely. Feel free at any time.
My initial examination of the first evidence was on January 23 of 2019.
2019.
Correct.
And that's when you analyzed or examined various items that came out of a grade G. That was water bottle, some sneakers, I think, a yellow jacket, a Gatorade bottle, item 27, I think you identified.
For this particular date, it was items 16 through 25.
16 through 25, okay. On 123 of 19, you examined a water bottle, a spent casing, Gucci sandals, and a blood stain on front of a t-shirt and a blood stain on the rear of the t-shirt. And also a blood stain on an Air Jordan sneaker, correct?
That's correct.
That turned out not to come back to this young man right over here, correct? Mr. Demons. I'm going to call him Jamel. It's easier. Okay. Isn't that correct?
At this time or later? 'Cause
Later.
Later. May I refer to my report? For that?
Absolutely. And give us a date that you did that,
Absolutely.
please.
So on January 25th of 2022 is when the comparisons were made to Mr. Devins, and he was excluded from all those items.
That was January of what?
The report was issued on January 25th of 2022.
I'm sorry.
I did my analysis on January 24th, the day before.
Okay. That was approximately 3 years after he was arrested. Did you know that?
I did not.
Then you analyzed, did you not, item 26, a yellow jacket, a Gatorade bottle, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And what date did you examine those items?
That was on August 24th of 2021.
August 24th, you said?
Correct.
Of 21. That was 2 years approximately after he was arrested. Did you know that?
I did not.
And those came from inside the Jeep. Did you know that?
I did not.
And those did not match Jamel, correct?
That's correct. He was excluded.
Then you received some additional items, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What was the date that you received the additional items?
They were received on multiple days.
Okay, give us the first date you received additional items, please.
I began processing the impact filter on January 5th of 2022.
That was approximately 3 years after his arrest.
The cutting of the headliner, which is item 34,
When did you receive that?
was I processed or began processing on January 28th of 2022.
Okay. Also, about 3 years after his arrest.
Objection, counsel's testifying.
I thought it was a question. Restate it. Sustain. Restate your question.
Did you know it was approximately 3 years after he was arrested?
I did not. Additional items were submitted. These were items 40, 41, and 42. Those were processed on April 25th of 2023.
April 25th of 23?
That's correct.
Did you know that was after we started this
Objection,
trial?
Your Honor, improper.
Excuse me. Watch from sidewalk.
Sir, did you know that when you received the blood stain on the headliner, that was after this trial started?
I did not know.
But you started that in April 25th of 23? Just 2 months ago?
The headliner was, that was prior.
Oh, I'm sorry. The item that you received on April of 23 was what?
Those were the contact swab, non-blood area, rear driver's seat. The blood swab of smear from rear of driver's seat. And the contact swab of front of driver side door handle interior.
Okay. And you did not know that was after this trial started, correct?
I did not know.
And none of that came back to the DNA of this young man, Jamel, correct?
Correct. It was deemed uninterpretable, as well as one of the items I did not attempt to generate a DNA profile because there was insufficient amount of DNA.
Do you know what the delay was in sending that evidence to you?
Objection, outside the scope, speculation.
And did you receive any other items in 2023?
Yes, one last item, item 43.
And that was the door handle of the rear door? Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
And did I hear you correctly that you first ran a test and it did not come back matching or belonging to our contributor to Jamel?
That's right.
And did I also hear you correctly, then you discussed something about your software with your supervisor?
With the technical leader, yes.
And then ran another test and had a 3-person contributor?
That's right. Yes.
And all of a sudden, it matched, or it was labeled as Jamel may have been a contributor?
That's correct.
What date was that, sir?
That was on June 1st, 2023.
Approximately 3 weeks ago?
That's correct.
Who requested that,
Objection, Your
if you
Honor.
know?
What's the objection?
Speculation, outside the scope.
Well, as far as outside the scope, so overruled, if he knows, he can answer.
Who submitted that item to you 3 weeks ago?
It would have been Miramar, the investigators.
Miramar Police Department?
Yes, I can look at my
Feel
submission
free.
form. It was submitted by Miramar investigator. Mark Moretti.
Moretti.
Who is listed on the submission form.
And that was the only item that supposedly matched Jamel's DNA, correct?
I believe so. I can look back just to confirm it,
Please do.
but I do believe that is an accurate assessment. Yes, it was the only item with the inclusionary likelihood issue.
Could you tell these folks when that DNA was placed on, supposedly, on the door handle?
No, I don't.
It could have been placed a week.
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
How long can DNA stay on an item?
The DNA can persist on items. Again, as I mentioned, heat, light, moisture can cause it to degrade or become unusable. But if DNA is deposited on the surface, it can last weeks, months, years, if kept in a nice, cool, dry environment.
Did you know this Jeep was stored in police custody in a safe, dry area?
I do not know.
May I have one other question? One other moment, excuse me. Thank you very much.
Is there any redirection?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Rhodes, is it unusual to receive multiple submissions over the life of a case?
No, it's not unusual.
Does the date in which you work a particular item have any effect on the results you report on?
No, it is not.
As to the likelihood ratio on item number 43, who was included in that particular item?
For both propositions, Mr. Thomas was included for both the 2-person and 3-person contributor propositions. Under the 2-person proposition, Mr. Henry, Mr. Williams, and Mr. Dimmons were excluded. Under the 3-person proposition, Mr. Thomas, Mr. Williams, and Mr. Emmons were included.
And with regards to the time of collection of that swab, would that be indicated on the box that it is found in?
Sometimes there are indications on the collection. I can look at the market receipt. They may, I'm not sure if it's a newer one or an older one, but I can look at the market receipt if you'd like.
Okay, and that would be item number 67, what's been put into evidence as states 33. Latex or not?
Yeah, they think so.
And so item 33 in evidence, is that item number 67 and you're labeling here?
Yes, that's right.
What was the date and time of collection according to that specific item?
So it's dated at 10/26 of 2018,
And the time?
1736.
Okay. If DNA is stored in an optical environment, will it persist forever?
I'm not sure about forever, but it will persist for decades.
And in terms of if it is collected on a cotton swab that is dry and sterile, is that a ideal place to perpetuate DNA storage?
Yes.
Nothing further.
I have one or two questions based on that, if the court will allow me.
Sure, go ahead, sir.
You indicated it's not unusual to get multiple submissions of evidence.
That's right.
Do you know why it took 5 years to submit that exhibit to you to analyze?
Objection, Your Honor, speculation.
He knows he can answer, do you know?
I do not.
Thank you.
Counsel, is there anything else to this witness?
No, Your Honor.
Is he excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, Ms. Step Counsel, you're excused. Ladies and gentlemen, my understanding is that's all the witnesses we have for today, and so we'll see everybody back tomorrow at 9 a.m. Remember the admonition, do not discuss the case, don't form any opinion about the case, don't allow anyone to discuss the case in the presence, and certainly no research, just leave your notepads on your chairs. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, sir. You're excused. Anything to discuss, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to do a sidebar.
Sidebar?
Yes.
And the jury got it. Are you?
Because of the cameras, I think you would be
That's
prudent.
fine. No, sidebar.
Thank you.
All right, is there anything else to discuss, Council?
No.
All right, so we'll be in adjourned till tomorrow. When can I expect these?
They are digital. I think they'll probably take until at least Monday, because if you want them in hard copy, they are, I think I'm conservative in saying, 400 pages.
Thank
Now, so it's clear, it's not 400 pages like a deposition transcript. It is 400 pages, and it's going to be more like look like a cell phone. And there might be 5 or 6 messages per page. So while it sounds very voluminous in number, it's not as bad as 400 pages would sound normally.
And this is what you shared with Defense Counsel.
Yes, they have the copies as well.
Thank you.
Digital.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.
Good evening.